I used to think I was the best spy there was. I could spot a lie in a single glance, read the calculation behind any smile, and had never trusted anyone until I met Lin Zhan. That cold, composed man remembered what I liked to eat, remembered that I hated the cold. Remembered things I had never even said out loud. Little by little, he made me believe that somewhere in this world there was finally someone who truly wanted me to stay, only I didn't know back then that the most dangerous traps aren't built with blades, they're built with tenderness. The day of Lin Zhan's triumphant return, the entire capital poured into the streets. I stood among the prisoners, hands bound behind my back, eyes straight ahead. I did not bow. My father was a general, and though he was dead, though our family name had fallen, I was still his son. I would not bow before anyone. The crowd screamed. Someone threw garbage. Someone spat. A child asked his mother why those people were tied up. I didn't catch the answer over the noise. I wasn't looking at them. I was looking at the man riding at the head of the procession, Lin Zhan, general. The man who had killed my father, not with his own hands, but with a battle so perfectly laid out that my father had no way out before it even began. He wore black armor and rode a white horse, spine straight as iron. Flowers were scattered under the horse's hooves. The crowd roared. He didn't look back, not at the crowd, not at the flowers, not at the prisoners. His eyes stayed fixed ahead, as though none of this existed in his world. Just as the procession passed where I stood, he turned his head. Not to look at me, just a glance in some random direction. But for one brief moment, our eyes met, cold, calm, like someone looking at an unclassified object. Then he looked away. I stood straight and watched the white horse disappear into the distance. Not hatred, not fear, just a cold note in my head. This one is harder than I thought. That afternoon, an order came from the general's manor. The remaining prisoners were taken to the execution ground. When my name was called, the soldier didn't lead me toward the gate. He turned inward, voice flat as a form being read aloud. Su Lang is to remain at the manor by order of the general. Status, concubine. The soldiers around him snickered. One whispered something to the man beside him. I couldn't hear the words, but I read the meaning in the way they looked me over and looked away. Son of an enemy general. Omega. Kept as a concubine, a humiliation more complete than death, because death ends. This would go on. I let the thought pass. Then I thought about what mattered more. This was exactly what my organization needed. A reason to be inside. A position closer to the general than any spy before me had ever managed. 30 days. I gritted my teeth and walked through the manor gate. I only needed 30 days. That first night, I sat in the middle of the room they had assigned me and waited. The room was larger than I expected. Lamps, a bed, a vase on the table. Someone had placed a fresh white plum blossom branch inside, still alive. I didn't know if this was the manor's custom or something prepared for me specifically. I didn't understand why that small detail unsettled me more than the rope marks still on my wrists. I'd kept a knife hidden in the lining of my clothes. The soldier who searched me had been sloppy. I pulled it out, set it under the pillow, and sat there to wait. Footsteps came at the hour of high. Slow, steady, unhurried, Lin Zhan pushed the door open and entered, plain gray robes, no attendants. He looked at me with a long, calm gaze, the way a craftsman looks at a material he hasn't decided how to use. I looked back. I didn't blink. You're smaller than I expected. No name asked. No explanation given. No mention of my father or the reason I was there. Just one flat observation. I said nothing. He stood for one more beat, then turned and left, pulling the door shut behind him. His footsteps faded. I sat until morning, hand resting on the pillow, fingers touching the knife handle, waiting for him to come back. He didn't. In those early days, I watched. Lin Zhan rose at the hour of yin before the manor woke and trained with his sword alone in the inner courtyard. He ate breakfast without attendants, pouring his own tea, picking up his own chopsticks. He worked through the afternoon and read until late. No one entered the study while he was reading. No one stood behind him more than 3 paces. The night guards rotated at midnight, never on a fixed schedule. I memorized everything. Calculated, the best window was the hour of Zai, a gap of 15 breaths between patrol rotations. Enough to enter the study, enough to act, enough to disappear before anyone noticed. I had it mapped out by day 3, then I didn't move, not out of fear. I kept asking myself why and couldn't find a convincing answer. Only that, every time I stood outside the study in the dark, looking at the thin line of yellow lamplight under the door, I would hesitate one more day, one day. Then one more. I started to hate myself for it. On the 7th day, Lin Zhan called me to the training yard. "Can you ride?" "Yes, come." No explanation. No asking whether I wanted to. The horse they brought out wasn't the gentle kind for beginners. I looked at it, looked at Lin Zhan, and understood this was a test. I didn't know what was being tested, but I mounted without hesitation. A moment later, I fell, not because I couldn't ride, because this horse wasn't used to strangers and it could distinguish the scent of an omega. I understood that 1 second before it threw me, I hit the ground hard. I lay still for a beat and checked whether anything had broken. Then a hand reached down. Lin Zhan stood there, hand extended, face as still as ever. No laughter. No mockery. I looked at that hand longer than necessary, then took it. He pulled me up in one clean motion, not releasing immediately. He held on for one extra beat, just long enough for me to find my footing. Then let go. Again. I brushed the dirt from my clothes, looked at the horse, and mounted a second time. I didn't think about the knife in my sleeve for the rest of that afternoon. I only remembered it later, back in my room, and couldn't explain why I had forgotten. On the 10th day, my organization sent word. A small piece of paper hidden in the bottom of a rice bowl, a system we'd used for years, never discovered. I read it and burned it immediately over the oil lamp, watching the ash and thinking about what to write back. 20 days remain. Report. In the end, I wrote, "No opening yet, continuing." Not a lie, I was still watching, still calculating. The 15-breath gap between patrols was still there every night. I simply hadn't stepped into it. I folded the reply and didn't read it back, because if I did, I would have to admit that. No opening yet and not willing to act were two different things, and I wasn't ready to face that. Lin Zhan didn't eat dinner with anyone. I had known this from the first day. He ate alone in his study, no attendants, no one sharing his table. No one dared disturb that habit. On the 12th day, he called me in, no warning, just a servant at my door. "The general invites you." The table already had 2 sets of bowls and chopsticks. Lin Zhan was reviewing documents and didn't look up when I walked in. "Sit." We ate in silence. The food was ordinary, nothing elaborate. The tea was slightly bitter, not what I was used to, but I said nothing. Near the end of the meal, he asked without looking up, "What do you like to eat?" I stopped mid-bite. No one had ever asked me that. Not because I didn't have an answer, but because the question came so naturally, as though this were perfectly normal between two ordinary people. "I'm not particular," I said. He nodded and didn't ask more. But the next morning, there was a plate of steamed fish on my breakfast table, the dish I'd reached for most the night before, without noticing I was giving myself away. I looked at that plate for a long time before I sat down to eat. I started asking questions I shouldn't have been asking. Lin Zhan wasn't like the rumors. No open cruelty, no beatings, no humiliation, not a single mention of my father or my family's ruin. He treated me like, I couldn't find the right word, not kindly, not coldly. More like a man waiting to see what I was before deciding what to think of me. That was more dangerous than cruelty. I reminded myself. He killed my father. He kept me here to humiliate a defeated bloodline. Everything he did, the shared meals, the fish, the calm way he said my name, had a purpose. I reminded myself of this every night before sleep, and every morning I had to start reminding myself again. On the 15th night, I walked into the study, the hour of Zai, 15 breaths between patrol rotations. I had stood outside this door 3 times before and turned back each time. This time I pushed it open. The room was dark. One candle nearly burned out on the desk. Lin Zhan lay on the dabbed against the wall. He slept there on nights he worked late. I'd known this since the first week. I stood 4 paces away. My right hand held the knife handle. He was breathing steadily. His face was calm the way a person's face is only when they're truly asleep. I stood there much longer than I should have. Then I thought of something completely absurd. If I act tonight, there will be no one to eat dinner with anymore. I hated myself for that thought. I set the knife down, turned, and walked out. I closed the door so quietly it made no sound. I couldn't sleep that night, not from guilt, but because I knew I was becoming someone I didn't recognize. The next morning, I overheard something not meant for me. 2 servants were cleaning the courtyard, thinking no one was nearby. One of them said to the other, half admiringly, half amused, "The general's strange, he sleeps but doesn't sleep." You can tell right away in the morning whether he was awake the night before, but ask him about it and he never admits it. The other laughed, said something I didn't catch. Then they both went inside. I stood at the corner of the corridor and watched them go. Last night he had been breathing steadily, face calm, no sign of someone who had just been awake. I thought about the 15-breath gap between patrol rotations, about the 4 paces from the door to the dabed, about the silence of a dark room I had assumed only I was awake in. I drew no conclusions. I only filed it away the way I had filed everything away since I came here. But this time, when I finished filing it, I understood. I had let my guard slip, and I hadn't even noticed when it happened. On the 18th day, Lin Zhan called me into the study, not for dinner. There was no food on the table, only a wide battle map spread out and pinned at the corners by an ink stone and 2 thick books. He stood beside the table, hand pointing at the map, not looking at me. "Come here." I moved closer, looked down, a campaign map. I recognized it immediately, not because I'd seen this particular one, but because I'd been told about that battle so many times that the terrain had been mapped into my memory like the landscape of my own home, the Western Mountain Range. The river cutting through the center. My father's position marked in red ink. Lin Zhan didn't explain, didn't point to anything specific. Just let me look, the entire battle, start to finish, laid out without omission. I looked, and I saw. Behind my father's defensive line, there was a small arrow. It didn't belong to Lin Zhan's forces. That arrow had cut off the retreat route from within, 1 day before the battle even began. I stood in front of that map for a long time without speaking. Lin Zhan also said nothing. He let me finish looking, then rolled the map up, placed it in the drawer, and locked it. As though this had been nothing more than a routine exchange of information. "You may go." I stepped out. The corridor felt longer than when I'd walked in. That night, I didn't eat. The servant brought food. I told him to leave it. I sat on my bed looking out the window until the room went fully dark, the lamp burning low while I didn't bother to add oil. My organization had told me my father was betrayed by Lin Zhan's forces, cornered and destroyed. I had believed that for years, had fed it and let it grow into a reason, a mission. The thing that kept me standing when there was nothing else to stand on. The arrow on that map didn't belong to Lin Zhan's army. I didn't know who it belonged to. I only knew that my organization knew and hadn't told me. That night I cried. Not for my father, but because I no longer knew who I was grieving, who I was angry at, what any of this had even been for. The next morning when I opened my door, there was a cup of tea on the table outside, still warm. No one standing there. No note from anyone. I picked it up, drank it, and went back inside. I sent word to my organization asking about the arrow on the map. No reply. It wasn't the first time I'd sent something and heard nothing back, but it was the first time I understood what that silence meant. My organization didn't answer questions that weren't useful to them. That wasn't caution or security protocol. That was how they managed their people. I sat with that understanding for a while. Then I burned the paper, went outside, and stood watching Lin Zhan practice his sword forms alone in the early morning light. He didn't know I was there. Or he knew and didn't show it. I couldn't be sure anymore. His swordsmanship wasn't showy. Every movement was short, precise, nothing wasted. Like the way he spoke, only what was necessary, nothing more. I stood there until he finished, then turned and went back inside before he could look over. The assassin came on an ordinary afternoon. I was sitting reading in the corridor when I heard something from the direction of the study. Not a loud crash, just something falling, followed by a silence that felt heavier than it should. I stood without thinking. When I pushed the study door open, I saw a man in black moving to circle behind Lin Zhan. I didn't think. I just stepped between them. The assassin stopped for 1 beat, thrown off. That beat was enough for Lin Zhan to act. When it was over, I looked down at my arm, a long cut, not deep, but bleeding. I didn't know when it had happened. Lin Zhan looked at the wound without speaking, then pressed me down into a chair. He found cloth himself, bandaged it himself, hands very gentle, more careful than the situation required. I looked at those hands and realized for the first time that I hadn't calculated the safe distance between us. "Why did you do that?" he asked, not looking up. I had no answer. Because I was asking myself the same thing. My organization sent a final extension order, 10 days remaining. I held that piece of paper for a long time. Read it over and over, as though reading it once more might change what it said. Then I burned it without writing back, the first time in my life I had broken an order. There was no clear reason I could name, not because the mission was impossible, not because there was no opening. Only that last night Lin Zhan had bandaged my wound with hands so light, and this morning I had woken up not wanting to do what I had been sent here to do. I sat watching the ash in the oil lamp and thought, if my organization knew the real reason, what would they think of me? Then I realized I no longer cared what they thought, and that was more frightening than anything else. Lin Zhan said my name for the first time on an otherwise unremarkable evening. He was reading. I was sitting by the window, looking out at the courtyard. We had been sharing the same room more and more often without either of us initiating it. It had simply started happening. He needed more ink, looked up and said, "Su Lang, hand me the ink stone." "Not you." Not "hey." Just my name, said as simply as you'd call someone you knew. I stood, handed him the ink stone, and he took it and kept reading, nothing more. I went back to my seat, looked out the window, and sat quietly for a long time with a feeling I couldn't name. Like something had shifted inside me before I could hold it still. That night I lay down and for the first time slept through the night without a knife under my pillow. My organization stopped sending messages after the last one I hadn't answered. That silence felt heavier than I expected, not because I was worried, but because I understood what it meant. They hadn't given up. They were waiting or preparing something else. I knew how my organization worked. I had been inside it long enough. When a spy goes dark, they don't ask why, they adjust the plan. But strangely, I thought about that and let it pass the way I might think about tomorrow's weather. No more sense of urgency. No more guilt. That afternoon, Lin Zhan taught me to play Waiki. He wasn't patient about explaining, he just played, let me lose, then pointed briefly at wherever I'd gone wrong. I lost 7 games in a row before winning a small corner in the 8th. He looked at that move for a moment, then said, "Better." Just that. But I remembered the way he said it, not praise, just acknowledgement. Like this was always going to happen, and he had only been waiting for when. The heat sickness came on a morning, sudden and badly timed. I was sitting in the study, a habit that had formed without my noticing, when I felt my body temperature spike abnormally. Pheromones began leaking through despite my effort to hold them back. I closed my eyes, breathed slowly, tried to stay in control, but an Omega's body doesn't always listen. Lin Zhan looked up from his desk. He didn't speak immediately. He stood, walked to the door, and locked it from the inside, the same calm motion as closing a window against the wind. Then he sat beside me, not too close, voice low and even, breathe slowly. I looked at him, guarded, confused, and too exhausted to hide either. He didn't look away, and he didn't look at me the way I had once feared. He just sat there, steady, the way a person sits when they've handled something like this before. "You have suppressants?" I didn't bring any. He nodded and didn't ask more. He stayed beside me until it passed, no advantage taken, no retreat. Just there, as though that was simply the obvious thing to do, the next day, someone brought suppressants to my room. No note from anyone. After that, something changed, without clear shape, without a clear boundary. The distance between us shortened in ways neither of us had decided to shorten. He didn't invite me to stay in the study, I just stayed, and he didn't tell me to leave. I stopped asking him the questions a spy would ask. I started asking what I actually wanted to know, like why he was reading that particular book, or why his swordsmanship didn't follow any established school. He answered briefly. But he answered. One evening he asked, "Where did you live before?" I hesitated for a beat, not from caution, but because it was the first time anyone had asked about my before as though it were something worth knowing. "Many places," I said. "Never anywhere long. He nodded and didn't press. But I could see him holding on to that answer, the way he glanced at some point in the middle distance for just a second before looking back down at his book. The first night Lin Zhan mentioned his older brother, it was raining softly outside. He hadn't meant to bring it up, it came out sideways, in the middle of some story about learning to use a sword as a child, when the name Lin Feng surfaced once and then stopped abruptly. "Your brother?" I asked. He looked at me as though surprised I'd noticed, then nodded. He left the army after a defeat, disappeared after that. His voice was flat, no rise or fall. No one knows where. I sat and listened. I didn't ask more because some things people say aren't meant to be questioned further. They're just meant to be heard. Rain tapped against the roof tiles. He said nothing else, lifted his teacup, looked out the window. I sat there with the name Lin Feng in my head and something heavy pressing on my chest that I couldn't name because I knew that name. I knew where that person was. And I couldn't say so. One rainy afternoon, I sat reading in the study while Lin Zhan worked through documents. No one had suggested it. I simply came in, sat in the familiar corner, opened a book. He didn't look up. We stayed there until dark without exchanging more than 10 words. The corner I sat in was the one by the window. I had chosen it early on because it had a clear view of the courtyard, the best angle to observe from. Now, I sat there because the afternoon light came in at just the right angle for reading without straining my eyes. I didn't know when the reason had changed. At one point I glanced up and found him watching me, only briefly, just a look before he dropped his eyes back to the next document. The lamplight in the room was warm and yellow, falling across his face at an angle that made him look different from the daytime, softer somehow. Or maybe I was just looking differently. I looked back down at my book without showing anything. But the page in front of me, I read the same short passage 4 times over and couldn't remember a single word. The characters slid past my eyes without landing because my mind was somewhere else entirely. When he called my name to ask where a book was, his voice was the same as always. I answered the same as always. No one knew I had just read the same passage for the 5th time. I stopped counting the days. It wasn't a conscious decision. Just one morning I woke up and realized I didn't know what day it was since entering the manor. I used to count every day, every hour, the way you count steps on a road that has a clear ending. I used to mark small lines on the back of a paper every morning, a habit from my very first assignment when my trainer told me. A spy cannot afford to lose track of time. The paper was somewhere in a drawer now. I hadn't opened it in weeks. That morning, Lin Zhan was training in the courtyard and I brought him tea. No one told me to. I just knew he'd be thirsty when he finished. He stopped, looked at the cup, then looked at me with something on his face I couldn't read, not quite surprised, not quite not. He took the cup. Drank. "Set it down, you made it too strong." "I'll make it lighter next time." He said nothing more and went back to training. I stood watching for a moment, then realized I had just said next time without thinking, as though next time was a given. As though I would still be here long enough to make many more cups of tea, and he would still be here long enough to drink them. I picked up the empty cup and went back inside. I didn't let myself think further, because if I did, I would have to face a question I wasn't ready to answer. One evening Lin Zhan drank alone. It wasn't his habit. I had never seen him drink before. I passed the study and found him sitting by himself in front of a half-empty wine flask, looking out at the dark window. Something about the way he was sitting that night was different from usual, not tense, not relaxed. Just a person sitting with something inside them they didn't know where to put down. I stood at the doorway for a moment. Then walked in, sat across from him and said nothing. I just refilled his cup when it emptied. He didn't send me away. Didn't ask why I'd come. Just looked at the refilled cup, then lifted it and drank as though it were the most natural thing. We sat like that for a while. Wind moved outside, dry leaves scraped across the courtyard. I felt no urge to speak, and strangely, being beside this person in silence no longer made me want to calculate anything. I just sat, breathed, let time pass, then he asked, voice unchanged, "Are you afraid of me?" I thought about it honestly before answering, not weighing what I should say, but actually sitting with the question and looking for the true answer. Not anymore. He looked at me for a moment longer than usual, like he was reading something behind the answer, then looked away and raised his cup. That may not be a good thing. I didn't know whether he was talking to me or to himself. The words could have meant many things, a warning, an admission, or simply a thought spoken aloud. I didn't ask. I just stayed, refilled when he was empty, until the flask was gone and the sky was almost light. When I stood to go, he said nothing. But his eyes followed me to the door. I knew because I felt them, though I didn't look back. He touched me for the first time without any reason. I was standing watching his morning training, a habit I hadn't noticed forming. The early air was still cold. I stood near the corridor pillar to block some of the wind. He finished, wiped the sweat from his face, and walked past me toward the door and rested his hand on my shoulder for one brief moment, lightly, the way you might lay your hand on a table as you pass. Then he kept walking, didn't stop, didn't look back. I stood still after he had gone. Not from surprise, or not only from surprise, but because the touch had been so ordinary. Not deliberate, not awkward, just natural, as though his hand had known that was the right place without needing to ask. I looked down at my own hand, as though checking whether anything had changed. Nothing had changed on the outside, only the feeling on my shoulder where his hand had been warm and steady and then gone. I stood there longer than I needed to, looking at the empty space of the courtyard he'd just walked through. There was nothing clear in my head, only something quiet, warm, and faintly frightening, spreading outward from the point where he had touched. The first kiss happened on an evening no one had prepared for. We were sitting side by side reading, a habit that had formed so naturally I couldn't remember when it started. The oil lamp was burning lower than usual because a servant had forgotten to add oil. The light in the room narrowed and went gold. Outside, the wind picked up and pushed a thin rain against the window, carrying in the smell of wet earth and night flowers from the garden corner. I looked up to glance outside and found Lin Zhan looking the same way. His face was very close to mine in the lamplight, closer than I'd realized, close enough that I could see every line clearly. Neither of us moved. I don't know who leaned in first, maybe both of us at once, maybe neither. And the distance simply disappeared the way it does between two people who have sat beside each other too many evenings for it not to, eventually. All I know is there was a moment when his lips touched mine, light, brief, tentative, like a question not yet spoken aloud. Then he stopped, looked at me. I didn't pull back. He kissed me again, slower this time, more certain, as though the answer had already been given and there was no need to ask further. His hand rested against my face, fingertips touching my temple so gently, gentler than when he had bandaged my arm, gentle enough that I had to keep my eyes open to be sure this was real. Outside, the rain fell. The lamp finished burning out and left only darkness and the sound of rain. Neither of us said anything after. We just sat together in the quiet, shoulder to shoulder, close enough to hear each other breathing. Late that night, I lay back and looked at the ceiling for a long time, listening to the rain slow and stop. For the first time, I thought, I want to stay here. Not because of the mission. Not because there was nowhere else to go, just because I wanted to, simple and heavy as that. And for the first time, I didn't push the thought away. In the days after that, neither of us mentioned it, not from awkwardness, or not only from awkwardness. Because there are some things that, once they've happened, don't need to be said. We still sat reading together, still ate dinner together, still had the same silences we were used to. Only the distance between us was a little shorter, a little more natural, and neither of us felt any need to explain why. One afternoon he sat behind me, hand on my shoulder, pointing at a passage in the book I was reading and asking what I thought. I answered. He disagreed, countered in 2 crisp sentences. We sat arguing about a book for more than an hour, his voice never rising, mine never rising, but neither of us willing to yield. Finally he said, "You're stubborn." "I'm right." He looked at me for a moment, then turned back to his own reading without another word. But I saw the corner of his mouth shift upward just before he looked down, very small, very fast, the expression of someone who didn't usually smile, smiling. I looked at my own page and couldn't read a single word for a while. The first night we were truly together, not because of the heat sickness, not because of any calculation, not for any reason that could be explained in words, just that I didn't want to go back to my room that night, and he didn't tell me to go. I couldn't fall asleep right away. I lay listening to his breathing even out beside me, to the wind outside the window, to the particular silence of a room that had gone to sleep. Such ordinary things, and so strangely remarkable. I couldn't remember the last time I had lain down without needing to calculate anything, guard against anything, or remember why I was wherever I was. This time I just lay there, and it was enough. His hand rested on my back, heavy and warm. His breathing was steady and slow. I closed my eyes and for the first time in months fell into sleep without anything cutting through it. When I woke in the morning, he had already left. On the table was a cup of tea, still warm. I sat with that cup alone and thought, so this is what ordinary feels like. One morning Lin Zhan set something small on the table as he walked past, said nothing. Didn't look back. I looked down. A white plum blossom branch, freshly cut, just like the branch in the vase the first night I had arrived at the manor. The one I had stared at back then without understanding who had put it there or why. I picked it up, held it for a while. I didn't know if he remembered that night or if this was a coincidence, and I didn't know which possibility was more frightening. If it was a coincidence, it was just a flower. If he remembered, then he had noticed from that very first night, had held onto a detail so small that I found myself wondering how many other things he had been quietly holding onto that I never knew. I put the branch in the water glass on the table, sat looking at it for a little longer. Then I thought, if there had been no mission, I would still want to be here. This time I didn't push the thought away. I sat with it for a while, let it stay, then stood up to make tea like any other morning. Some things don't need to be resolved right away, they just need to be known. The days after that were ordinary, close, warm, no large events, no turning points. Just the mornings I brought tea to the courtyard, the evenings we ate in easy quiet, the nights we sat side by side until it grew late and neither of us wanted to be the first to stand. He started sharing small things, not confessions, not explanations, just brief words that surfaced naturally mid-conversation as though he hadn't noticed he was saying them. The first time he had held a sword, his first horse. A small battle at the northern border that he remembered not for whether he'd won or lost, but because the weather had been bitterly cold and the soldiers hadn't had enough to wear. I listened. I didn't ask more when he stopped. I only let the small pieces fall and rest there. One evening he asked me, "Have you ever wanted something you knew you shouldn't want?" I looked at him. Yes, he nodded and didn't ask more. We sat in silence with that answer until the lamp burned out. Lin Feng arrived at the manor one morning I hadn't prepared for. I was in the courtyard when a servant announced a guest, and then I saw him walk through the gate, tall and lean, wearing plain dark brown robes, looking nothing like someone returning after years away. He glanced around the courtyard. Then his eyes landed on me. I stood still, held his gaze. We had never met in person, but I knew his face from the files, and he knew mine for a different reason entirely. In one brief moment, we both understood that. Then Lin Zhan stepped out from inside, and both of us looked toward him at the same instant, as though nothing had just happened. "Brother," Lin Zhan said, voice without inflection, neither warm nor cold. "It's been too long." Lin Feng smiled, stepped closer, laid a hand on his younger brother's shoulder. "You look better than before." I stood at the edge of the courtyard watching the two brothers meet and felt something heavy beginning to settle in my chest, not surprise, not fear. Just the feeling of someone who knows something is about to change, without knowing which way. The meal that evening proceeded normally, too normally to feel comfortable. Lin Feng sat across from me, pleasant and easy, talking to his brother the way a returning older sibling would, asking about the court, about the army, the things brothers catch up on after years apart. Lin Zhan answered briefly, neither warm nor cold, the way he spoke to everyone except me. I ate and said little. Lin Feng asked me a few questions, polite, light, the kind that don't require real answers. I replied at the right level, nothing more. On the surface, we were two strangers meeting for the first time, but I noticed him watching, not directly, but at an angle, glancing sideways each time Lin Zhan and I exchanged a word, cataloging small gestures, measuring the distance between us. I recognized that kind of watching. Because I had done it to other people. At the end of the meal, Lin Feng lifted his teacup, looked at me over the rim, and smiled, a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Su Lang looks quite comfortable here. I've adjusted, I said. He nodded as though that was exactly the answer he needed. That night, Lin Feng came to find me alone. I wasn't surprised. I had been waiting for this since the moment he walked through the gate that morning. He entered my room without knocking, sat in the chair as though it were his own, and looked at me with a gaze entirely different from the one he'd worn all day, the polished pleasantness gone, replaced by the cold directness of someone who no longer needed to perform. The mission has changed. He said, "You no longer need to kill Lin Zhan, you only need to take the commander's seal from his study. You have the time and the position to do it." I looked at him. No, Lin Feng showed no anger, no threats. He simply sat there a moment longer, then stood, smoothed his robe, and walked to the door. Just before leaving, he said, voice still perfectly gentle, "You have time to reconsider." After he was gone, I sat in the dark room and found my hands clenched without knowing when they'd tightened. Not because I was afraid of him. Because he had left too easily, the way someone leaves when they know they don't need to force anything, because they already have another way. Lin Feng stayed at the manor for several more days, ostensibly to visit his younger brother after years apart. Each day he watched a little more. I could feel it even when I couldn't point to anything specific. Not staring, not asking direct questions, only his presence in the manor making everything around me feel slightly different, like the air before rain, heavy and still in a way that wasn't normal. I started noticing things I hadn't paid attention to in weeks. How close Lin Zhan and I stood. The way he poured tea for me before pouring for himself. Small things I had only ever felt before. Now I saw them clearly, as though reading them from outside, and I understood Lin Feng was reading them too, in the exact same way. One afternoon, he sat drinking tea with me in the courtyard, Lin Zhan absent. He spoke about nothing important, whether news from the border, the kinds of things anyone might say. But at the end, he looked at me and said, calm as a weather observation, "He's not someone who shows his feelings easily." I said nothing. He smiled, set down his teacup and stood, "But with you, it's different." The first piece fell on an evening I hadn't prepared for. I was passing the study, the door not fully closed, just slightly ajar. I had been about to keep walking when I heard Lin Zhan's voice from inside, low and even, speaking to someone. I stopped without deciding to. My feet stopped before my mind could catch up. The subject has stabilized. Phase 2 can proceed. I stood there for one breath, then kept walking, steady and even as though I had heard nothing. Back in my room, I sat down and let the word subject rest in my head. Just those 2 words, no conclusions, no rushing to connect them to anything. I had misheard, or it was a military matter that had nothing to do with me. Or the word had a different meaning in a context I hadn't heard enough of. There were several reasonable explanations. I lay down, closed my eyes, and tried to sleep. But those 2 words stayed there, not large, not small, just sitting in one corner of my mind and refusing to leave. A few days later, the second piece. We were eating dinner, the conversation drifting to people who don't have anywhere they belong. I couldn't remember how it started. Only that at some point Lin Zhan set down his chopsticks and said, voice slow and certain, "People who don't belong anywhere tend to observe better than others, because they have to understand every place before they can decide whether to stay or go." I looked at him. That was what I had thought. Not close to what I'd thought, exactly what I'd thought, in the precise way I had thought it, by the same logic I had used to explain myself to myself. I had never said it to him. I had never said it to anyone. I smiled and lifted my teacup. "You're right." He glanced at me for a moment, then looked back down and kept eating under the table. My hand tightened around the cup. Not hard enough for him to see, hard enough for me to feel. 2 pieces, maybe coincidence. I told myself that and kept eating. The third piece came from someone who hadn't meant to give it. That morning, I was sitting in the corridor when Zhang Cheng, Lin Zhan's most trusted aide, the one who had followed him before he was ever a general, walked past carrying a stack of documents. He noticed me, stopped, and spoke in the easy tone of someone with somewhere to be. Resting here, Su Lang? The general's busy this morning. The plan that was in place before you arrived looks like it's reaching its final stage." He stopped abruptly. Looked at me. Understood what he had just said. "I mean, the general's schedule has just been full lately." He added it quickly, bowed slightly, and walked away faster than he'd come. I sat still and watched his figure disappear around the corner of the corridor, the plan that was in place before you arrived. I sat there for a long time. Didn't stand, didn't do anything. I only let the three pieces line up beside each other in my head, the word subject, the sentence that fit too perfectly, and the words just spoken, and looked at what they made when they stood together. A complete picture, clear, no other way to read it. I went back to my room, closed the door, and sat down on the floor. No crying, no anger. I only sat and let everything move through my head in order. From the beginning, from the white plum blossom branch that first night, from the steamed fish the next morning, from the battle map, from the suppressants with no name attached, from the words about people who don't belong anywhere. One by one, in order, skipping nothing, he had known I was a spy from the very beginning. He hadn't kept me here to humiliate me. He'd kept me because I was useful to a plan I didn't know the full shape of. Everything he had done, the map, the meals, the words said at exactly the right moment, had been calculated. I sat with that until it was fully dark and the servant came knocking with food. I told him to leave it. I didn't touch it. The hardest thing wasn't being used. I'd been used before by many people. I knew what that felt like. The hardest thing was that I had believed, truly believed. And I didn't know which parts of everything that had happened were real, which were calculation, and whether there was any way to tell them apart. The next morning I came to breakfast as usual, sat in my usual place, watched Lin Zhan pour tea, smiled when he pushed the cup toward me. Ate, said the right things, went quiet at the right moments. When he asked if I wanted to go outside the city that afternoon, I said yes, voice light and normal. Inside, nothing was normal at all. But I could do it, because he had taught me how without knowing he was teaching me. Sit in front of someone, keep your face still, put the feelings somewhere else inside you. I had learned from the best. For the first time since entering the manor, I was truly performing. And for the first time, I understood how a person can do that to someone they care about, not because they don't care, but because sometimes there's no other choice. That afternoon, I asked permission to go outside the city alone. Lin Zhan looked at me for a moment, that reading look I had come to know, the one I now understood had been reading me all along. Then he nodded without asking why. I walked to the river bank outside the city and sat on a large stone looking out at the water. I didn't go looking for Lin Feng, didn't send word to my organization. Just sat, because I needed somewhere no one was watching me, reading me, calculating anything about me. The wind came down along the river, cold and straight. I sat until the sun began to drop, until my mind stopped running and there was only the sound of water and wind. Then I stood and turned back toward the manor, not because I had decided anything. Only because I didn't know where else to go, and I realized that even that was an answer to something I hadn't been willing to name. That night Lin Zhan came to my room. He knocked, the first time he had knocked instead of simply pushing the door open. I didn't know if he noticed the difference or if it was chance. I opened the door. He looked at me for a moment and asked, "Are you all right today?" Simple question. Ordinary voice. His eyes on mine in the way he looked when he wanted to read the true answer, not the one being spoken. I looked back at him. And for the first time, I looked in reverse, into the eyes of the person who had been watching me all these months, and asked myself, in all those times he had looked at me this way, how many were real and how many were calculated? I couldn't find the line. Maybe there was no line. Fine, I said. He believed me. He came in, sat beside me, stayed until late the way he always did. I let him stay, not because I had forgiven anything, not because I had decided anything. Only because tonight I needed to believe that some part of all of this was real, even just a small part. He had already gone when I woke the next morning. I opened my eyes, looked to the side, and found his spot still faintly warm. On the table there was something small, another white plum blossom branch, fresher than the last one, placed beside a cup of tea still steaming. I lay there looking at it without getting up. Before, I would have picked it up and felt something warm. Now I looked at it and asked myself, is this real, or is this also part of something I don't fully know? That question had no bottom. I knew if I started asking it, I wouldn't be able to stop. I sat up, got dressed, and went out. I didn't look back at the branch on the table. But I didn't throw it away either. I left it there, the way you leave a question you're not ready to answer. Then I went to find Lin Feng. I found Lin Feng in the East Garden, where he'd been sitting alone in the mornings. I'd noticed over the past few days. He saw me coming and wasn't surprised. He only lifted his teacup and waited. "I'll do it," I said. Lin Feng looked at me for a moment, the measuring look, checking whether I was being honest or performing. Then he nodded and set his cup down. "The seal is in the bottom left drawer of the study. A simple lock, you know how to handle it. I need time. You have 3 days." He stood and smoothed his sleeve. "Don't let feeling slow your hand." I didn't answer that. I turned and left, walking back. I wasn't thinking about the seal, wasn't thinking about the plan. I was thinking about the white plum blossom branch still on the table, and asking myself what I had just done, and why, and whether those two things could even be separated. I didn't take the seal on the first day or the second. Not because there was no opportunity. Lin Zhan was out of the manor all morning on the first day, the study empty and unwatched. I stood outside the study door longer than necessary, hand resting flat against it, then took my hand away and left. The second day, I ate dinner with Lin Zhan as usual. He talked about a patrol near the northern edge of the capital, voice calm, pouring tea for me before pouring for himself. I listened and nodded and smiled at the right moments. That night he asked, "What are you thinking about?" "Nothing," I said. He watched me for a moment, that reading look. This time I didn't know what he was reading because I wasn't sure anymore what I was hiding. There was too much at once, anger, pain, and underneath all of it, something more persistent that I didn't want to name. He didn't ask again. He sat beside me until late. I let him sit there and looked out the dark window and did nothing. On the third night, I went into the study, not to take the seal at least, that's what I told myself. Just to be inside, to stand in the middle of the room and look at the familiar things. The desk where he usually sat, the daubed against the wall where he slept on late nights. The tall bookshelves nearly reaching the ceiling, the books arranged in an order only he understood. I stood in front of the bottom left drawer, simple lock. Lin Feng had been right. I could open it in one breath. I stood there for a long time. Then I sat down on the floor, back against the bookshelf, and sat still in the dark. Didn't open the drawer, didn't take anything. Just sat here in the room of the person who had used me, surrounded by things that belonged to him, and tried to find what I actually wanted when I set everything else aside. The answer came slowly and not the way I'd wanted. I didn't want the seal. Not because I was afraid, not because I couldn't, but because doing it would make me no different from him. Using someone and leaving, just in the opposite direction. I stood, walked out of the study, and pulled the door shut behind me. The next morning I went to find Lin Feng for the last time. I can't do it. Lin Feng looked at me in silence for a moment. Then he exhaled, sat down, and gazed into the distance with the look of someone recalculating from scratch. "You understand what that means?" "Yes." "You'll no longer have the organization's protection if your identity is exposed." "I know," I said. "I've known since last night." Lin Feng looked at me one final time, not the calculating look, but something different, harder to read, as though he was seeing something he hadn't planned for. "You actually love him?" Not a question. I didn't answer. I turned and left. The answer didn't matter anymore because either way I had already chosen. And for the first time in my life, I chose for myself, not for anyone else. Lin Zhan found out that afternoon, not because anyone told him, not because he had been following me. Only that he looked at me across the lunch table and saw something had changed. I knew because he set his chopsticks down earlier than usual and looked at me differently from any other day. That evening he found me in the study, closed the door. Didn't sit, just stood there looking at me and asked directly, "You met with him?" Not a question. I looked back at him, didn't deny it, didn't confirm it, only sat with that for a beat and then said, "I want to know what was real from the beginning until now." The room was quiet. Wind moved through the window crack outside, the only sound for a long time. Lin Zhan didn't answer immediately. He looked at me, that long, calm gaze, the one I had once believed meant he was truly seeing me. Now I wasn't sure. Everything you saw was real, but not all of it happened naturally. He didn't deny that, and that was the answer. I was the subject, I said. From the first day, Lin Zhan stood there, no defense, no explanation, just looking at me with something on his face I couldn't read, not guilt, not indifference, something in between, the plan that existed before I arrived. I continued. The battle map. The suppressants, the words about people who don't belong anywhere. I paused. You knew exactly how I would react to each of those things. I knew who you were, he said, voice low. I knew what you needed to lower your guard. That doesn't mean, last night, I cut him off. The branch this morning, did you calculate those too? He was quiet longer this time. Not everything was calculated, he said. I believed that. And because I believed it, it hurt more, not less. Because if I hadn't believed it, everything would have been simpler. I could have just hated him and left, but I believed it, and I didn't know which parts were real, so I didn't know what to hold on to and what to let go. But some of it was. I stood. He didn't call after me. I went back to my room, sat down, and for the first time didn't know what I wanted. Not what to do next, but what I actually wanted inside. Did I want him to explain more? Did I want him to stop explaining? Did I want to have never known? Did I want to have known sooner? None of those were fully right. I sat until late, listening to the manor at night, the sound of guards rotating, wind through the corridors, the distant, never fully quiet sound of the capital. Sounds I had heard every night since I came here, that I now knew by heart without ever realizing I had learned them. Maybe that was the problem. I had let this place become familiar without noticing, let that person become familiar. And now that it had all fractured, I couldn't tell which parts of what I felt were genuinely mine and which parts I had been led to feel. That line, if it existed, I couldn't find it. Lin Feng was arrested the next morning. I hadn't known in advance. I only heard sounds in the courtyard before full dawn, voices, soldiers. When I stepped out, Lin Feng was already being led away, hands bound, face composed in the way of someone who had considered this possibility long ago. He looked at me as he passed, one brief glance, no anger, no accusation, just a look as though he wanted to hold on to it. Lin Zhan stood on the veranda watching the soldiers lead his brother away. His face showed nothing, the familiar composure I had once read as coldness, then as concealment, and now no longer knew how to read. I stood a few steps away from him and didn't move closer. He didn't look back at me. He only stood there until the footsteps had faded past the gate, then turned and went inside as though beginning an ordinary day. I watched his back and for the first time couldn't read anything from it. My identity was exposed within 3 days of Lin Feng's arrest. Not because Lin Zhan had disclosed it. I knew that, though I couldn't have said why. Only that in the course of investigating Lin Feng, there were threads that couldn't be hidden. Threads that pulled on other threads, and eventually one of them led to me. The Emperor's soldiers came to the manor one morning. I stood in the middle of the courtyard and watched them enter, and I didn't run, not because I couldn't, but because I was tired of running. Tired of being a different person in different places for different reasons. Lin Zhan stood on the stone steps above and looked down. I looked up and met his eyes 1 second, no more. Nothing was said, nothing needed to be, then I turned back to face the soldier standing before me and said, "I'll come with you." The imperial prison was cleaner than I expected. I sat with my back against the stone wall, looking up at the small barred window near the ceiling, square, just large enough to see a piece of sky. Blue in the daytime. 1 star at night if the clouds stayed clear. I didn't think about death, though that was what the Emperor's order was waiting to give me. Not because I wasn't afraid, but because my mind had no room for it. My mind had only one thing, turning over and over, refusing to stop the night he stayed, his hand on my back, heavy and warm. His breathing steady and slow, real or not real? I had asked that question hundreds of times since being brought here and never found a satisfying answer. Because that question had no bottom, ask it once and it pulls out another and another, until there's no peace left to believe in. In the end, I stopped asking, not because I had found an answer, but because I realized that whatever the answer was, I still wanted that night to have been real, and no one could take that from me, not even the person who had created it. An old servant from the manor came to see me in prison on the afternoon of the 4th day. He brought a small package, dried cakes and tea, the kind of thing you bring to someone who won't need to eat much longer. He set it down, didn't meet my eyes, and spoke in the voice of someone working to sound normal. The general went to the palace yesterday. I said nothing, accepted the position of Capital Defense Commander. He paused. No longer goes to the front. Stays in the capital to coordinate internal security for the rest of his life. I sat with those words, for the rest of his life. Lin Zhan, a man of battlefields, a man who trained with his sword before the sky went light, a man who had ridden at the head of a victorious army without looking at anyone, bound to the capital. For the rest of his life, in exchange for my sentence being reduced from death to exile. The servant stood to leave. I asked, my own voice sounding strange in the cold stone room, did he send any message? The servant shook his head. No, I nodded, looked down at the package on the floor. No message, because there was nothing to say, or because there was too much and no knowing where to start. I didn't know, and this time I didn't try to find out. The night before I left the capital, there was a knock at the prison door. The guard opened it, stepped outside, and pulled it shut. Then came footsteps I recognized, slow, even, unhurried. Lin Zhan walked in and stood in the middle of the small stone room, looking at me where I sat beneath the dim lamp. I looked back at him. He looked the same as always, plain dark robes, hair neatly tied, face still. But there was something different I couldn't immediately place. Then I understood. This was the first time I had seen him not knowing where to begin. He opened his mouth, stopped, looked down at his own hands for a moment, looked up. He started, then stopped. I waited. There were things I didn't calculate. His voice was lower than usual. From the beginning, I calculated almost everything. But, he paused again, like a person searching for words that don't exist. I watched him stand there, unfinished for the first time, and felt something ache in my chest in a way that was different from the past several days. Not the ache of anger, not the ache of betrayal. Only the ache of watching someone try to say something they don't have language for, because they had never needed that language before. I don't hate you, I said. He looked at me. But I can't say I wasn't hurt. I stood. Looked at him one last time, long enough to remember, not long enough to waver. Then turned away, looking at the stone wall in front of me. Go home. He stood there a little longer. I heard his breathing, heard the silence of the small room, heard what he couldn't put into words. Then footsteps. To the door, one pause, then he was gone. Early the next morning, I left the capital. The sky wasn't fully light yet. Frost still clung to the roof tiles. A small escort of 4 soldiers who said nothing and only walked. I walked among them, hands unbound, the only thing different from the day I had entered the capital. When we passed the gate of the Lin Manor, I didn't look in, not because I didn't want to, but because if I looked and saw nothing, gate closed, courtyard empty, no sign of anyone, I didn't know what I would feel. And if I looked and saw him standing there, I didn't know what I would feel then either. So I kept my eyes ahead and walked past. But I knew, without looking, without any evidence, that at this moment he was standing in the study, looking out the window toward the gate. I knew because I understood this person. I understood him in a way perhaps no one else did, and that was the most bitter irony, the sharpest pain, and the one thing with no solution, to understand someone and still not be able to stay. Many years later, I lived in a small piece of land near the northern border. A new name. A new life, teaching the village children to read and write, children who had grown up without either, who looked at me with the eyes of someone seeing something miraculous in words on a page. I taught from morning to evening, ate with the villagers, slept in a small room that looked out at the mountains. Simple enough that sometimes I forgot I had ever been anyone else, sometimes. Not always. News from the capital came through passing traders, scattered and irregular. Lin Zhan still held his position. Still alone, the capital was still peaceful. I heard these things and didn't ask more, the way you hear news about a place you once passed through, not a place that was ever yours. I told myself that. And most of the time I believed it. One late autumn afternoon, I was teaching a child to write. A girl of 8, hair tied on both sides, tongue poking out when she focused. I sat beside her, showing her how to hold the brush, where to place her hand, how to let the strokes move left to right without shaking. Outside, the wind came through, carrying the smell of dry grass and cold earth at the turning of a season. I glanced up, a reflex, without intention. The afternoon sky was gray-blue, clouds low, wind pushing yellow leaves past the window frame. And the direction of the capital, far away, nothing visible, just a direction among 4 directions. I looked toward it for 1 second, only 1 second, then the girl asked, "Teacher, is this character right?" Her voice clear and high, pulling me back to where I was sitting. I looked down at the page. The strokes were still shaky, still unsteady, but going in the right direction. "Yes," I said. "Write it one more time to be sure." She nodded, bent over the page, and her tongue came out again. Outside, the wind kept blowing. I didn't look up again. And that is the story of Su Lang and Lin Zhan, one who entered the relationship through a mission, one who kept the other there through a plan prepared long in advance. Between the calculations and the secrets that could not be spoken, they lived through the most peaceful days either of them had ever known, and the most painful. Thank you for listening all the way to the end. After hearing this story, I have one question for you. If you had to name a single moment when Lin Zhan was no longer a person carrying out a plan, but simply a person in love, which scene would you choose? Share your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear what you think.